some years ago, I was driving a 26-foot box truck. You know, you've seen them out on the road. You know, some of them are done by Penske or Enterprise or U-Haul. And man, those trucks they're not that hard to drive. But one of the things that I learned the hard way is that those trucks all have a blind spot. I never will forget it. I was riding on the interstate, and I was in the left lane, and I decided that I was ready to slide over and get back on the right lane. And the passenger, as I started to ease over on the right lane, I had checked my mirrors, those big mirrors on each side of the truck, and I had checked those mirrors and I didn't see anything. And as I was easing over to the right-hand lane, the person in the passenger seat started screaming, and somebody, I didn't know where, was blowing the horn like crazy. And as I rechecked my mirror on the right side of the truck, all of a sudden I saw a red car that was now appearing in the mirror. And I promise that red car was not there when I checked my mirrors before I started getting over in the right-hand side, in the right-hand lane. And what I realized is that those trucks have a blind spot. It didn't matter how many times I checked my mirrors, there is a place in that truck, at least the way that I had those mirrors angled, there was a certain area I was not going to be able to see by just checking my mirrors. And so I had to acknowledge the fact that there's a blind spot, and I could either ask someone to help me with my blind spot and try to avoid any potential damage to other vehicles in my own vehicle, or I guess I could have just kept on driving and acted like there wasn't a blind spot, and no telling what kind of disaster could have been waiting up ahead. Well, the same is true about leadership. As you lead an organization, as you lead a team, we as leaders have blind spots. And it really is up to us to either just continue on in our leadership and pretend like there's no blind spot, which could create considerable wreckage and damage to a team or an organization, or we could choose to just acknowledge, hey, in my own leadership journey and in my own leadership of an organization, I've got a blind spot, and I may have multiple blind spots. So what do you do when you finally just acknowledge, okay, I've got some blind spots, what do I do, and how can I know if they're present? Well, I want to provide us today five realities of blind spots in our leadership. And then at the very end, I'm going to give us 4 things that we need to go do right now to help us as leaders adjust to the blind spots that we all have. So here we go, 5 realities about blind spots. One is that blind spots grow in isolation. Let me explain. The longer a leader operates without honest feedback, the larger their blind spots will become. So the longer that you lead without any kind of honest feedback in your leadership, that blind spot is going to become bigger and bigger and bigger. Success, authority, experience, that can unintentionally create some distance between a leader and what's actually happening. So when you see success as a leader, or you gain more authority as a leader, or you experience some unintentional, as you do that, it's going to create this unintentional distance between yourself and what's actually happening. Okay, so that blind spot is going to grow if it's left in isolation. So here's a few things you can do in that situation. One is you can invite 2 or 3 people to regularly speak into your leadership. I would do that. Ask specific questions to those that you lead. Ask them, hey, was I missing something on that? Or did you see if maybe I might have overreacted in that scenario? And this is what's really hard about this whole idea of isolation. And one way to keep that from happening for you as a leader is create a culture where disagreement is safe and it's welcomed. Okay? If you'll be willing to do these 3 things, it can kind of help that blind spot from growing in isolation. But the second thing about blind spots, the second reality about blind spots in our leadership is that blind spots often show up in patterns. Let me explain. If you see recurring conflict on your team, might be an indication that there's a blind spot in your leadership. If you see recurring staff turnover, just a lot of turnover in your organization all the time, turnover. Doesn't always indicate that there's a blind spot, but it might be an area that you want to dive into to see if maybe there's a blind spot in your leadership that might be causing some of that turnover. Maybe your organization is having some stalled momentum right now. Man, you are soaring in your organization and now it's either stalled or beginning to decline. That's another indication that maybe that's a pattern and there may be a blind spot that's existing. Or maybe there's just some strained relationships in your organization between you and those that you're leading. That could also indicate that there's a blind spot. It could be a pattern there, and it could be a blind spot in your organization. A couple things, if that's the case, is reflect quarterly on repeated frustrations or breakdowns. So every once a quarter, just say, okay, where was there some frustrations? I'm wondering if that might be a pattern that I need to pay attention to that would lead me to a blind spot. Here's another way that you can kind of address those patterns is that you can journal anything that was like an emotional trigger for you during a quarter or during a certain time period. What constantly irritates you or discourages you? Well, that could lead to a pattern that's impacting a blind spot. The third reality about blind spots in our leadership is that most blind spots are overextended strengths. So it's our strength to the 10th power. Oftentimes those can lead to a blind spot. Nothing wrong with a strength. We all love good strengths, but they also can turn into a blind spot. For example, let me give you a few examples of how that might happen. Let's say you're a real decisive leader. You're just decisive. Some people struggle with decision paralysis, but that's not you. You hear the situation and you know how to make a decision, and you're very decisive in doing that. The blind spot could be you might become very controlling. Your ability to be decisive could lead you to be controlling, be a controlling leader, and that could be a blind spot for you. Nobody feels free to share ideas because you're so controlling. Another example, vision. Maybe you're just an unbelievable visionary leader, and when someone shares something, you can close your eyes and you can see where the organization needs to go. You can see it, man. I mean, God has given you the vision. You can see it. The blind spot could be that you become impatient. Other people may not see it as quickly as you see it. And you can become an impatient leader, which could become a blind spot. You're like, why can't they see it? Why can't they do it? Well, you're just out in front right now, and your vision is allowing you to see that, but not everybody's there. That could be a blind spot in your leadership. You become an impatient leader. Also, confidence. You might be just a really confident leader. You've always been in leadership roles, being the person that's making decisions, and you become very confident. And if you're not careful, that confidence could lead to a level of arrogance. And that could be a blind spot for you in your leadership. And people could say, man, it's really hard to follow this person because they're such an arrogant person. And you never meant it to be that way. It's just a blind spot. You're really confident. Unchecked strengths can distort your leadership impact. And so you want to make sure that your extended strengths don't become a blind spot for you. So what can you do about that? Well, you can identify your top 3 strengths and just say, I'm aware these are my strengths. And if I'm not careful, they'll become a blind spot. And you may even want to ask your team how my strengths might negatively affect them. And if you've created a culture where they're willing to talk and share, then that could be a real help for you as you deal with the blind spots that we all have. The fourth reality about blind spots, okay? Blind spots affect the culture more than we may realize as leaders. Leaders, whether we like it or not, we set the emotional temperature for our organization. And if we're not careful, if we're unaware of how we're doing that, our tone, our body language, our reactions, it can create blind spots that just quietly shape a culture of fear and of hesitation and of confusion. And so we have to be careful. Our blind spots will set that culture more than we realize. It's a reality, and so we got to be aware of it. So after a meeting, you could ask someone, hey, how did that come across? When I said so-and-so, how do you feel like the room received that? One other thing, it may sound a little silly, but I think it could help you, is to record yourself speaking and evaluate your tone and your posture. Because if it's true that we set the emotional temperature of the organization, then we got to be real keen on what's going on there and how we're doing. The fifth reality about blind spots in our leadership is that humility is the antidote to blind spots. Blind spots will shrink in environments of humility. Leaders who admit mistakes, apologize quickly, and remain teachable will create an atmosphere and an environment of trust. And that's what we want as leaders, right? If it's true that the number one quality that people are looking for in leaders is a person of integrity and someone they can trust, then if one way to do that is to be a humble leader, man, we want to create that, and we want to do that. And that can help us as we walk through and try to maneuver around our blind spots. So we publicly acknowledge when we miss something, or we publicly say, hey, I was wrong about that, or I'm sorry about that. Here's 4 things that we as leaders need to do right now very practical. Here's what we need to go do right now to address the blind spots that we all have. Okay? Number 1, build a personal feedback team. Build a personal feedback team. So what does that look like? Go select 3 to 5 people who you give permission to speak honestly into your leadership. It can be peers, direct reports, and maybe even someone outside the organization. So number 1, go build a personal feedback team. Number 2, conduct a 360 assessment. You could use a structured tool, or you could do it more informally. You could have different people in your organization send you your strengths or weaknesses and maybe some things they'd like to see you change, and have them emailed to you, and you compile a list, and that'd be a real informal way to do it. There's organizations that exist like Best Christian Workplace who can conduct a 360 for you for a fee, and you'll get some great feedback, some that people may not have shared before with you. But that can help you identify some blind spots. Okay, so build a personal feedback team, conduct a 360 self-assessment, identify your emotional triggers. Pay attention to the moments where you overreact, or maybe where you withdraw, or where you become unusually intense. Okay, so identify those things, write them down. You don't have to share them with anybody, but just see if there's any commonalities there of things that would cause an emotional trigger for you. And that may lead you to a blind spot and help you deal with it. So you want to build a personal feedback team. You want to conduct a 360 self-assessment. You want to identify your emotional triggers. And the last thing I would say we need to go do as soon as possible is to first diversify your inner circle. In other words, surround yourself with people who think differently than you. Maybe they have different personalities, they have different strengths, different backgrounds, and different perspectives. So that's 5 realities that exist for all of us as leaders as it relates to blind spots. And that's 4 things we can do right now to help us lead through those blind spots. The most dangerous blind spot that all of us as leaders have is believing that we don't have any blind spots. That leads us into a really bad position. The most effective leaders aren't those without blind spots. They're those that are committed to discovering the blind spots and correcting them. Just like me riding down the interstate in that truck. I could pretend like there was no blind spot there. And if I had continued driving, pretending like there was no blind spots, I was going to cause considerable damage to someone's vehicle, someone's life. The same is true with us as leaders. If we just continue leading, pretending like we don't have blind spots in our leadership, we can do tremendous damage to an organization, tremendous damage to someone who's on our team, and we will be less effective as a leader because of our unwillingness to acknowledge and address the blind spots that we all have in our leadership journey.